am Famine. Okay, you're watching the stream. Before this show starts, I want to warn you that we are going to be talking about some of the ugliest aspects of conflict, including sexual violence, human rights abuses. If that is not what you want to watch right now, I want to tell you so you've got an option to do something else. For the rest of our audience, thank you for staying. Last year, the government of Ethiopia launched a military offensive in the northern part of their country, in a region known as Tigray, against the former governing forces of that region. As far as we can tell, that conflict, that war, the fighting is continuing and civilians are caught in the middle. We spoke earlier to the UN humanitarian agency known as OCHA. This is Gemma Connell, and she told us what she was seeing and what she was fearing.
As each day passes, we are more and more concerned about the dire humanitarian situation in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. For nearly 3 months, many people across that region have not had access to the basic things that humans need to survive: food, water, and healthcare. We're especially concerned because this conflict erupted right when the farmers should have been bringing in their harvest, and the crops, many of them, have been lost. We're also deeply alarmed about the reports that we're receiving of horrific sexual violence against women and girls. While we have made some progress with the clearance of supplies, we still have many humanitarian staff who urgently need to be on the ground, and we have yet to receive the clearances for them to move. We call again today for urgent, free, safe and unhindered humanitarian access to reach these people who are in desperate need.
I want you to meet our lineup today. We have ZECHARIAS, we have MEAZA, we have VANESSA. Thank you very much for being on the stream. ZECHARIAS, tell our audience who you are. Remind them you are a regular visitor when we talk about Ethiopia. Go ahead.
It's nice to see you again, Femi. So for the umpteenth time, my name is ZECHARIAS ZELALEM. I'm a freelance journalist and contributor to Al Jazeera and The Telegraph, amongst other outlets.
Thanks for coming back. MEAZA, welcome to the stream. Tell our audience who you are, what you do.
Thank you for having me today. My name is MEAZA GIDEY. I'm a Tigrayan. I am an activist as well as an international relations researcher.
Nice to see you. And VANESSA, tell our international audience who you are and what you do.
My name is VANESSA TSEHAYE. I am the Horn of Africa campaigner at Amnesty International.
Good to have you. We also invited the spokesperson for the Prime Minister. That spokesperson is on the road right now. We've been communicating via WhatsApp, and she sent me a pretty substantial statement, which we will include in this conversation. And also, if you're on YouTube, of course, you can be part of this show at any time. Jump into the comment section and you too can be part of this show. So let's start with the first part of the statement from the Prime Minister's spokesperson. And this, there's something that I spotted here, guests, and she's talking about any armed confrontation. It is bound to destabilize the lives of civilians, but the federal government is supporting provisional administration and functioning systems and service delivery so that civilians are being taken care of. So expecting civilians to be in a dire situation, but the government is there to help them. Let's first of all talk about the situation, ZECHARIAS. As far as you can tell, conflict still happening in the north of Ethiopia?
Yes, there are mounting reports that fighting is indeed ongoing across the region in different parts of Tigray. However, this does contrast somewhat with the depictions of the situation on the ground. According to the foreign minister's spokesman earlier this week at a press conference, he stated that normalcy was in the process of being established and that the government was mobilizing all of its resources and personnel so it would be able to adequately address the humanitarian crisis on the ground. However, this depiction contrasts greatly with that of international aid organizations such as the UN, OCHA, as you mentioned earlier, CARE International, amongst others, who say that the ongoing efforts to prevent and to avert starvation are insufficient and inadequate. Something like a third of aid delivery shipments have been rejected by the Ethiopian government. and bureaucratic hurdles are preventing aid agencies from addressing the problem on the ground and reaching the populations who have been so terribly affected by the 2.5 months conflict. So contrasting narratives, but a lot remains hidden due to the region still being largely shut out and cut off from the greater world.
MEAZA, what are you hearing and seeing from people in the northern part of Ethiopia that is giving you concern? Still in a conflict situation? Still war?
Yeah, as ZECHARIAS said, there are contrasting narratives to this. However, we have been able to hear from personal accounts of people who returned from the war zone as early as yesterday, and they were telling us that there is an active war happening everywhere across Tigray. Of course, in some parts of Tigray, particularly Mekelle, there might not be an active war. However, majority of Tigray is still being ravaged with warplanes and drones, and troops are still there killing and massacring people. However, the most worrying part of all of this is that humanitarian aid is not being allowed to enter into Tigray, and over 4.5 million people are facing famine and starvation. And all of this is being worsened because Eritrean troops are actually actively looting resources, the very little resource that was left from the destruction and burning that people could have used to save their lives. So the warning situation on the ground is that our people are not only dying because of bullets, but also because of starvation and lack of medication.
I want to share this thought with you, Vanessa. This is from YouTube. This is Nati Tesfa. I have many family members and friends who live in the Tigray region, but since the war broke out, I can't get any information about them. The international community shall now act to save lives, or maybe she means they have to act to save lives. What are you able to get in terms of connecting people, reconnecting people? What is the difficulty?
Well, I mean, if you look at what's happened in Tigray since the start of the conflict, it's a complete information blackout. And I think this is obviously a family member who hasn't been able to reach their loved ones. They don't know how they're doing, if they're alive, if they're fled, what the current situation of their status is. But from a kind of justice perspective, the fact that there hasn't been any information coming out of Tigray, straight from Tigray, is a huge problem. I mean, we can talk about access in terms of humanitarian aid, which I will do much more. That's the whole point of this program. But access is always also to kind of understand what is happening in Tigray right now. If we had access in terms of internet, even phone services, we could have a much better idea of the crimes that have been committed, human rights violations that have been happening. The international community could act much more informed, and can also do much more if we have more information. And this has been unfortunate, and of course has helped certain narratives thrive, such as normalcy, or the war has ended. Those kind of narratives are so much harder to contrast when there's no access for us to reach.
Why do you say narratives? Because I'm hearing that a lot, and hearing that a lot from various different parties, almost as if, well, your story is this story and our story is this story. Why do you even say narratives when we can see that people are in great difficulty? Vanessa?
Well, it's hard to kind of go against if there's a federal government that is saying that the conflict is over. And this is not from now, this is from back in last year, saying that the conflict has ended. But we are continuing to hear testimonies. The United Nations, of course, has been stating since then that the conflict is continuing, fighting is continuing in parts of the region. Then that becomes a narrative. A federal government's narrative will always be stronger than activist organizations, especially when it's happening within their own borders. So it becomes this war of narratives that makes it harder for journalists, human rights researchers to join in and to bring their perspective when access is so difficult to gain.
I want to bring in the voice of Bizrat, and Bizrat is really focusing on conditions for civilians. Have a listen, have a look.
So we're now close to 60,000 refugees from Tigray and Sudan, about 31% of which are minors. And we're hearing that some of the health facilities are serving over 1,000 refugees each. And there's a shortage in food and medicine, including for women who gave birth en route or at the camps. Similarly, one toilet is serving hundreds of refugees, resulting in frequent sickness, and there's fears of a large COVID-19 outbreak. And then there's the trauma of experiencing the airstrikes and seeing other family members or fellow citizens being slaughtered. And if that's not enough, there's also fears that human trafficking could be high, as Sudan is one of the traditional migration routes to Arab countries. The crisis continues to worsen. I've only captured a fraction of it. And to address it, we need to call on the international community to help in the removal of Eritrean troops out of Tigray, unimpeded humanitarian access, a ceasefire, and independent investigations.
Again, that call on the international community. I want to zoom in, though, ZECHARIAS, on the Eritrean troops. Tell me more about those troops.
Yes, well, there's been a slow trickle pace and yet consistent emerging of photos, videos that have been analyzed by experts and geolocated to Tigray. And these give weight to claims that there are indeed Eritrean soldiers operating allied with the Ethiopian forces in Tigray. The Ethiopian government for itself, at least officials in Addis Ababa until now, are still consistently denying their presence on the ground. However, there's been mounting evidence, media reports, of course, the murmurs amongst well-sourced diplomats, as well as consistent eyewitness testimony from the refugees, as Bisrat mentioned, who are in Sudan, and those who, as a reporter that myself, I've been able to contact since the reopening of phone connections in a couple of towns. The problem here is that whereas the Ethiopian government every now and then releases communiques or holds press conferences to parlay its version of what's going on in the region, the Eritrean government has thus far remained mum, and it is unclear exactly who the Eritrean military presence in Ethiopia is accountable to right now, because the commander-in-chief, President Isaias Afwerki, is yet to address the greater international audience and issue his own justification or pretext for why he has decided to intervene on behalf of Abiy. And when it comes to the mounting reports of gross human rights violations, gruesome atrocities that his forces are alleged to have carried out, it makes it extremely problematic, and with no one willing to be taken into account, or no one here facing the music, if you will, with regards to queries by the press for who would be responsible for some of the atrocities that we've heard over the past few months, definitely exacerbates the worsening humanitarian disaster, the one that has left 4.5 million people needing emergency aid.
If I may just add there, Fahmi, I wanted to mention that it's not only eyewitness accounts that are actually speaking of the Eritrean troops' involvement or existence in Tigray. There has also been an intelligence-like satellite imagery, as ZECHARIAS said, but in addition to that, a general, a member of the Abiy Ahmed's regime, has actually admitted on a tape, on a record, that Eritrean troops were indeed in Tigray committing some of the atrocious war crimes that could amount to crimes against humanity and war crimes. So he has been talking about how Eritrean troops are actually in Tigray raping women and looting resources. So although the Abiy Ahmed's regime is formally denying the existence of Eritrean troops, there are facts that could actually support otherwise. And I think this is mainly why Abiy Ahmed is blocking the humanitarian corridor, because if humanitarian corridor is open, then journalists and the world will get to see that Eritrean troops are indeed in Tigray committing some of the atrocious crimes. So I just wanted to add that there.
Vanessa, pick up, please.
Yeah, I think, the fact with the question around access is one that people don't really understand, because humanitarian access is something that a state is obliged to do in a conflict. Well, not just a state, but any party of the conflict is obliged by international law to allow humanitarian access if needed. And the Ethiopian federal government's decision not to do so obviously raises questions. And you can speculate around why they've decided not to open up the humanitarian corridor or access to Tigray.
Vanessa, can I share something with you? So this here on my laptop is the Ethiopian ambassador to Switzerland, okay? Come here on my laptop so that you can see this. At the same time, the federal government and Tigray interim administration are distributing humanitarian relief services to the needy. Vanessa, go ahead.
Thank you. Well, I think it brings us back to the first question, which is the battle of the narratives. If, for example, federal government is now saying within our borders, we're doing all of this, this is going really good. It's necessary for international organizations to A, be able to verify that, and B, to be able to assist if that's the help that is being provided is not needed. There has been access to Tigray, and I think it's important to emphasize that it's not a complete blackout that we're seeing. Since November, there's been very limited access to United Nations agencies, UNHCR, OCHA that was mentioned before, and they've been saying that there's a dire need on the ground that is not being met with the response from the federal government. This means that the aid that is being kind of given by so many different countries is needed, and it's waiting at the border. And to look at how the process is actually going is that when they asked for access and when this deal was made in November, it was said in a way that gave a lot of people hope. A lot of people who were organizing at the time were saying, oh, this is great. We've received this access that we were asking for. But it said that it was secure, it was going to be consistent, but since then they've implemented the system where you have to apply for both cargo and for personnel. And at first, as ZECHARIAS was saying, the cargo shipments were going really slow. So the process of getting cargo to get into Tigray was taking way too long than what the need on the ground actually was. And then the actual system that was taking personnel was taking even longer. And now OCHA is saying that the personnel system is so slow that cargo is actually coming in at a higher rate than people are. So aid is coming in, but there's no people, there's no aid workers to actually distribute aid and make sure that it's coming to the right people and that's being given. So you can see that there is a need that is coming from people who are on the ground and are saying that there's a desperate need, and the government is saying we're already providing this, but there's no way to verify that. And when all of this help is available, what reason does the government have to deny it?
So I've got several questions here on YouTube, multiple questions, and guess I know you're going to come off the back of each other, but also include our audience as well. So this is Philman. What is the justification given by the Ethiopian government for blocking humanitarian corridors if the war is over? ZECHARIAS, very quickly on that.
Well, the Ethiopian government's official position is that even if the war is over, there are still mop-up operations and thus an existent security risk. However, the fact is that there are areas which are fully uncontested under the control of Ethiopian government forces or their Eritrean allies, and aid agencies and staffers have come to me and explained how they've been denied access to even these areas. So this further bolsters the points that VANESSA was making about access to the region and how this, I mean, it does definitely imply that there is something being concealed from the greater public.
Okay, all right, understood. MEAZA, go ahead.
Yeah, it's obvious that the Abiy Ahmed regime has signed 2 agreements with the UN to avail humanitarian access to the people of Tigray. However, we know that humanitarian access has been completely denied, mainly because, first of all, hunger is being used as a strategy to subjugate and to exterminate the people of Tigray. That's how I feel as a Tigrayan. Hunger is being used as a strategy. But most importantly, I want the world to know as a Tigrayan that the humanitarian access, no matter how available it is, the Tigrayan people will not have access to it unless the Eritrean troops are withdrawn from Tigray completely. Because we have been hearing reports how, although there has been a little bit, efforts to avail humanitarian aid by concerned individuals within Ethiopia and international NGOs, but the Eritrean troops were on the borderline to loot it and to take it away, even ship it all the way to Eritrea. That's what we have been hearing. So the most important point here is that there needs to be an immediate withdrawal of the Eritrean troops from Tigray if humanitarian aid is to ever reach to the people of Tigray.
Having been in contact with the Prime Minister's spokesperson, they would violently say that this is not, I shouldn't say violently, vehemently say that this is not the case. I will show another statement with them in just a moment, but I just want to pick up, MEAZA, on what you were saying about using hunger as a weapon of war. A number of people, not just on YouTube, but that we spoke to, were saying that this is the case, and it is reminding them of the Ethiopian famine of the 1980s that took place in the very same region. Here's Luam.
Ethiopia weaponizing hunger as a warfare is nothing new. The Derg regime did that in 1983 to 85. My mother lived through that famine that killed 1.2 million civilians. Currently, Abiy is using the same tactic, imposing a man-made famine in Tigray. Until this day, he has cut off telecommunication and has blocked humanitarian aid workers from entering Tigray. On top of that, he invited Eritrean forces who are looting, raping, massacring, burning farms. As a result of this senseless war, 4.5 million Tigrayans are facing mass starvation. 2.3 million children are in dire need of humanitarian aid. Horrifying stories are emerging daily, people dying from hunger in their sleep. Full access to humanitarian aid is needed urgently before millions perish.
So going back to that statement from the Prime Minister's spokesperson, Prime Minister's office, they push back on the idea of there being food insecurity because there was food insecurity in Tigray, they said, before the conflict started. And they said, regardless of this, the federal government is committed to ensuring that humanitarian assistance reaches all in need and the vulnerable, and that they are coordinating this humanitarian assistance with the Ministry of Peace, international partners, UN agencies. Vanessa, I'm getting questions on YouTube now, which is, so what is the government doing? What are you seeing that they are doing? Bearing in mind that ZECHARIAS says it's a mop-up operation, but there's still some fighting happening in the north of Ethiopia right now.
So, yeah, I mean, as the statement and other statements that they've made in the past couple of weeks have shown, they're shown a lot of pictures of food that they've been distributing, the amount of numbers. Like, I think if I'm not mistaken, they said that 85% of Tigray, of the people in need, have received assistance. But again, this goes back to access. For me, internet access, phone access, physical access to the region is imperative for any challenging of the official narrative to be done. And in this situation, what we're seeing is week after week, the United Nations, the UNHCR is reporting of how dire the need is on the ground. And to go back to what the government is doing, you can also say, what is the government not doing? Well, the requests to bring in the food, to bring in the aid workers are being either denied or delayed. And I can see that in the statement, they make references to Tigray being a region that already had food insecurity, etc. But you can look at, the fact that a lot of people in Tigray were not living in food insecurity. They were, as you mentioned before, either dependent on the food that they were kind of harvesting and then selling, or depending on trade. And trade to Tigray has been cut off since the conflict started 3 months ago. You can look at the refugees who were living in the camps, who had fled a regime just north of Tigray in Eritrea, who were dependent on international aid to survive and were waiting for the shipments to be made to their camps. Hitzat, Shimelba, which are two of the camps who have been completely inaccessible since the start of the conflict, have not received any support. And the UN is reporting that a lot of the residents are have fled because of so much of the violence, but also there was no food. We spoke to someone at Amnesty, researcher who spoke to one of the victims, who said that we have to eat leaves and drink water from an untreated well because there was nothing. And to kind of say that this is not happening when the testimonies that are coming out are so strong shows again why the need for access is so important. So that statements like these can't just be made, but they need to be challenged, and they need to be made sure that these people are just not being left behind just because the cameras are not on them right now.
ZECHARIAS, there's something that I've often see when we talk about on the stream about issues, particularly really difficult issues in other countries around the world, particularly on the African continent. People basically say, mind your own business. This is me summarizing. Have a look here on my laptop. This is where we were talking earlier about Eritrea's involvement in Ethiopia's Tigray region. And then I'm just going to scoot down here to this comment. Is there any tangible evidence? Why is the USA and other aid organizations concerned that much? That second bit. What is it the concern of the international community? Can you sum that up in a sentence, ZECHARIAS? Why should the rest of the world be focused on what is happening in Ethiopia when Ethiopians themselves, some of them are saying, mind your own business? Go ahead.
Well, obviously, I think when you go back to atrocities that have taken place in the context of war or in the shadows of war, if you look at what happened in Rwanda, or if you've looked at what happened in Srebrenica in the 90s, we've tended to hear time and time again the leaders of the first world
because of history. That's why.
say, never again.
Yeah.
And,
right.
we're seeing
That's right.
mounting reports of atrocities. So I'd assume it's to
ZECHARIAS,
ensure that
thank
they have
you.
a clean conscience.
MEAZA, thank
Thanks.
you.
Yeah.
Vanessa,
I
appreciate you
just
being
wanted
part
to
of the
add
stream
there.
today. And we're right at the end of the show, but you know this will not be the last one we do on Ethiopia. Thank you, guests. Thank you, YouTubers. Appreciate you. See you next time.